settle in and let your breathing slow, like a tide that does not need to hurry. Somewhere far from your bed, a research ship rocks gently in the dark, and the ocean keeps its steady, indifferent rhythm. You might imagine the seafloor as a finished picture, neatly drawn and labeled. But for most of human history, it was a blank page, cold, deep, and politely refusing to be seen. Tonight, you follow the oceanographers who learn to find warmth without ever touching it. Not by looking first, but by listening, and by noticing the faint, strange fingerprints that hot water leaves in colder water. This is the kind of search the Sleepless Scientist appreciates. Patient, quiet, and full of small clues that slowly become a real place. And somewhere beneath the waves, hidden vents breathe gently into the dark, as if the planet is exhaling in its sleep. You are on the ship now, not as a hero, but as a quiet pair of eyes in a dim control room. The air smells faintly of metal, coffee that went cold hours ago, and salt that never truly leaves. Outside, the ocean is black, and it keeps moving like it has a schedule you will never see. Inside, the maps are unfinished, and that is the first honest thing you learn tonight. Because the deep sea floor was not ignored out of laziness. It was ignored out of physics. Light dies quickly in seawater, and pressure grows heavy, fast, and without mercy. So for a long time, human knowledge stopped at the surface like a timid animal. The deep was there, beneath everything, and we simply did not look at it. When people did imagine it, they imagined it wrong. They imagined a flat, silent plain, like a parking lot at midnight. But the seafloor is not flat, and it is not finished. It is cracked, folded, torn open, and stitched back together, all in slow motion. And in a few places, it is warm, not warm like bathwater or sunlight on skin. Warm like a bruise in the cold, a small injury where the planet leaks heat. Hydrothermal vents are those leaks. They are places where seawater finds a fracture, slips down into rock, and returns altered. It comes back carrying heat, minerals, and chemicals that do not belong in ordinary deep water. They are rare compared to the size of the ocean, but they are not mysterious in the way ghosts are. They are mysterious in the way a distant smell is mysterious. You do not see the fire. You do not touch the flame. You notice instead that the air is different. In the deep ocean, the difference can be subtle enough to miss and steady enough to trust. So the search begins the way most deep ocean work begins, not with a camera, but with a kind of listening. The ship keeps its pace in the dark, and the crew keeps theirs. Night does not change much on the open ocean. It only makes the horizon disappear, which is oddly clarifying. You learn to respect the blankness. You learn that a blank map is not emptiness. It is ignorance with good manners. The first stage of finding vents is admitting you cannot see them directly. A vent field might be smaller than a city block, hiding in a ridge thousands of miles long. It might be active for decades, or it might shift and fade before anyone returns. So you do not begin by searching for chimneys. You begin by searching for likely places where the seafloor is young and broken. That means you need a map. And to make a map, you need sound. And once you accept how little we can see down there, the next step is learning how to feel the seafloor without ever touching it. sound travels through seawater in a way light simply cannot compete with. A pulse of sound can cross miles of dark water and come back with a story. Not a poetic story, unfortunately. A practical story, measured in time, shaped into depth. The ship sends out a sonar ping and then waits. It is not dramatic. It is patient, like knocking on a wall and listening for the hollow places. The sound spreads downward in a widening cone, and the seafloor reflects part of it back. The echo returns to the ship, and instruments record the delay. Longer delay means deeper water. Shorter delay means the bottom is closer. That is the simple heart of it, and it has guided a lot of human curiosity. But simple does not mean easy. The ocean is noisy in quiet ways. Water layers bend sound like glass bends light. Bubbles, plankton, and tiny temperature changes can blur the echo. So mapping becomes an act of repetition. Line by line, the ship moves, and the sonar paints the darkness in strips. You watch it happen on a screen glowing blue and gray. The control room is calm, because it has to be. A sudden mistake here does not just waste time. It wastes days of fuel and weeks of planning, and the thin patience of a crew. So voices stay low, hands move carefully. Someone calls out small numbers, and someone else writes them down like a ritual. On the screen, the seafloor rises and falls. A ridge appears, a long backbone under the ocean. Mid-ocean ridges are not one place. They are a seam, a scar that wraps around the planet where plates pull apart. The seafloor here is young by geological standards. New rock is made, cooled quickly by seawater, then cracked again by the stress of spreading. If you wanted a place where seawater could slip down into hot rock, this is where you would start. You are not looking for a perfect mountain. You are looking for damage, fresh fault lines, collapsed pits, places where the crust looks recently broken, like a sidewalk after a winter freeze. The most interesting maps are the ones that look unfinished. There is a special kind of silence when a ridgeline resolves on the screen. Not the silence of nothing happening, the silence of everyone realizing that something has finally become real. Because for most of human history, this ridge did not exist in any usable way. It was an idea, a theory, a guess based on earthquakes and magnetic stripes. Now it is a shape with slopes and valleys. Now you can point and say, the seafloor is higher here and lower there, and you can start to imagine where water might flow. Still, sonar does not show warmth. It shows terrain. It shows the bones, not the breath. A vent can hide in a depression, or behind a small rise, or in the rubble of a collapse. The seafloor is good at hiding things from anything that stays above it. So the map is only the first layer of knowing. You make it anyway, because even imperfect knowledge is better than drifting blindly. And because the ocean rewards patience, if it rewards anything at all, in the middle of the night, the ship turns at the end of a survey line. It begins another pass, steady and unhurried. You watch the ridge stretch across the screen. Like a sleeping animal's spine, you begin to suspect that most of the planet's true geography is like this. Present, immense, and largely ignored because it does not fit neatly into human schedules. But even a perfect map cannot show warm water rising, so the search shifts from shapes on the bottom to traces in the water above it. Down in the deep, most seawater is stubbornly consistent. It is cold, dark, and reluctant to change. It sits in layers, organized by temperature and salt, and it moves slowly, like thought at 3 in the morning. This steadiness is what makes vent plumes detectable, not because plumes are loud, because the background is quiet. Hydrothermal vent fluid starts as ordinary seawater. It seeps into cracks in the crust, and it travels downward. As it goes, it meets rock that is far hotter than the ocean has any right to be. It heats up, it reacts with minerals, it strips metals from the crust, and gathers chemicals like souvenirs. Then it rises again, because hot fluid is lighter than cold fluid, and nature loves a simple rule. When it finally exits the seafloor, it does not stay hot for long. The cold, deep ocean is ruthless about stealing heat, but the vent water leaves fingerprints as it mixes, a slight increase in temperature, a change in chemistry, tiny particles that form when hot fluid meets cold seawater. Like underwater smoke, oceanographers have names for these clues, but you do not need all the names tonight. You only need the idea that the water above a vent is different. Different enough to measure if you are careful. And careful is the whole personality of this work. So, you lower instruments on a long cable into the dark. They go down slowly because the ocean is deep and because fast movement is how you break expensive things. The cable hums with tension. The winch turns steadily and someone watches the readouts. Depth increases in calm steps. The instrument package is sometimes called a rosette because scientists are romantics who pretend they are not. It is a ring of bottles and sensors built to close at specific depths. It can take water samples without contaminating them with surface water. It can record temperature, salinity, and other quiet properties of the sea. And it can carry sensors designed to notice odd chemistry, a hint of dissolved metals, a trace of hydrogen sulfide, that rotten egg signature of vent chemistry, a shift in turbidity, meaning tiny particles clouding the water. The instrument does not see the vent. It tastes the ocean, slowly, like a cautious animal. You wait while it descends. The ship rocks gently, and time stretches. It is hard to explain how much of oceanography is waiting. The work is full of long pauses that are not breaks. They are part of the measurement. The ocean does not care that you are tired or excited or worried about the cost of ship time. It will do what it does. So you meet it where it is, and you measure what you can. At a certain depth, the instrument package enters water that is older than the surface by decades or centuries. This water has been out of contact with air for a long time. It has not seen sunlight since before the newest buildings in your town existed. It is still seawater, still salt, still heavy, but it feels psychologically different. It is as if you have stepped into a room where the doors have been closed for generations. And somewhere in this layered darkness, a plume might be drifting. Not a plume like a geyser in air, a plume like a slow bruise in the water column. It rises, it spreads, it thins, and it is carried sideways by deep currents. That sideways drift is important because it means the clue is not directly above the vent. The water whisper you detect might be miles away from the source, so you do not get the comfort of a straight line. You get a trail that curves, fades, and requires interpretation. The sensors record quietly as the package moves. When it reaches the target depth, it pauses, hanging in darkness. Then, on command, a bottle closes with a soft, mechanical snap. It captures water from that exact depth, like a small jar filled in a hidden spring. One bottle is not enough, so you take another, higher, then another, lower. You sample a vertical slice of the ocean. You do it again along another line, and another. This is how you turn a rumor into a location. The first time a sensor shows a small anomaly, nobody cheers. They lean closer. They check the calibration. They ask if the instrument might be wrong, because the ocean loves to make fools of confident people. A faint temperature bump could be a sensor glitch. A chemical signal could be contamination from the ship. So, you repeat the measurement. You follow the same track slowly, as if tracing a path in snow to see if footprints are real. And when the oddness appears again, in the same depth range, in the same general region, something shifts in the room. Not excitement, exactly. More like quiet certainty. The kind you feel when you realize you left the stove on and you are already too far from home. A plume means a vent is somewhere. Not necessarily here, not necessarily close, but somewhere on this ridge. Now the work becomes a gentle narrowing. You run another survey line, crossing the first at an angle. You look for the strongest signal. You map the plume like you map the seafloor, not with sound, but with chemistry. Each cast is a question asked politely into the dark, and the ocean answers in small, measurable ways if you are patient enough to listen. The deep sea is good at hiding its sources, because mixing spreads everything thin. But vent plumes leave enough of themselves behind to be tracked, at least for a while. Particles can linger, chemical imbalances can persist, instruments can detect differences smaller than your body could ever feel. You, personally, would not notice a fraction of a degree change down there. Your skin would just register cold and more cold. But sensors are not trying to be comfortable. They are trying to be honest. And honesty in the deep sea is mostly about tiny deviations. The ship continues to move at its careful pattern. The wick disappears behind it, swallowed by the black water. Above, the stars might be out, but nobody is really looking at them, because tonight, the real sky is below. And when the water itself starts whispering directions, the next question becomes, what exactly is making that whisper? A plume suggests heat, but it also suggests geology. It suggests a place where the crust is fractured enough to let seawater in. It suggests a heat source close enough to matter. That heat source is not a magical furnace. It is the slow, relentless heat of Earth's interior, leaking outward the way a body leaks warmth into a cold room. At mid-ocean ridges, tectonic plates pull apart. Magma rises to fill the gap, then cools into new seafloor. The process is steady, but not tidy. As new rock forms, it cracks. As plates shift, faults open. As earthquakes rattle the ridge, pathways change. Seawater, always eager to occupy a space, seeps down into those cracks. It travels deeper than you might expect. Not to the center of Earth, of course. Just deep enough to meet rock that is hot enough to transform it. Down there, pressure keeps the water from boiling in the normal way. It can reach temperatures that would flash boil water in your kitchen. But at depth, under the weight of miles of ocean, it stays liquid, dense, and reactive. It becomes a kind of moving solvent. It dissolves metals from the rock. It picks up sulfur and other chemicals. It changes its personality entirely. Then it rises because hot fluid wants to rise, and fractures provide a route. When it exits back into the ocean, it meets cold water and cools rapidly. Metals precipitate out, forming mineral particles. These particles can build chimneys, slow towers of rock grown from fluid, like stalagmites built in reverse. Some vents billow dark clouds of mineral-rich fluid. People call them black smokers because humans are incapable of seeing something without naming it after a bad habit. Other vents are gentler, clearer, with fluid that looks less dramatic on camera. But even the gentle ones can leave strong chemical trails. The vent field itself might not be one neat hole. It can be a scattered neighborhood of openings, cracks that breathe, small seeps. Some are only a few finger widths across, hidden under a lip of fresh basalt. Some are wide enough to vent a steady, shimmering column, like heat above asphalt on a summer road. You are not watching a single mouth. You are tracking a whole system of circulation, stitched through rock like unseen plumbing. Seawater goes down cold and ordinary. It comes back up hot and opinionated, carrying dissolved rock like gossip. And because the crust keeps shifting, the routes keep changing. A fracture seals itself with minerals. An earthquake opens a new crack a few meters away. A chimney grows taller until it collapses under its own weight. The seafloor is doing construction with no building code and no interest in your schedule. So vents are not permanent monuments. They are events that can last and then stop and then start nearby. You learn to think of a vent field like a garden that sprouts where the soil is warm. Not because it is gentle, because it is temporary, and because it appears where conditions allow it. Down there, conditions are everything. Temperature decides which minerals stay dissolved and which fall out as solid grains. Pressure decides whether water can carry heat without turning to vapor. Chemistry decides whether a vent plume smells, in a human sense, like rotten eggs. That smell is hydrogen sulfide, a molecule that living things can use like fuel. On the surface, it is the odor of something gone wrong in the fridge. In the deep, it can be lunch. That is the basic insult hydrothermal vents offer to your intuition. You grew up thinking life needs sunlight. You grew up thinking warmth comes from above. Down here, warmth comes from below, and life does not ask permission. But before you get to the life, you stay with the geology a little longer, because the geology is the reason vents can be found and lost and found again. At a mid-ocean ridge, plates spread apart at a pace that feels slow to you. It can be as quick as fingernails growing, or slower, depending on the ridge. In human terms, that is nothing. In geological terms, it is relentless. New crust forms, cools, cracks, and sinks away from the ridge axis. And as it moves, the heat source changes. You can have a vent that is vigorous when magma is close. Then the magma shifts, and the vent wanes, like a kettle taken off the burner. The water might still circulate, but it comes up cooler and less chemically extreme. Or the plumbing route gets choked with precipitated minerals. Imagine pouring sugary syrup through a straw, then letting it harden. Now imagine that straw is a fracture in basalt, and the syrup is metal sulfide minerals. Congratulations, your vent just self-sealed. This is why the search is never a single straight line. You are hunting a moving target, in the dark, with clues that drift sideways. Even the plume you detect is not a neat arrow pointing down. It is a smear, a gentle bruise spread by currents you cannot feel from the ship. Deep currents can be slow, but slow is not the same as still. Over days, a slow current can carry vent signals far enough to mislead you. So, oceanographers do what careful people always do. They build a case out of overlapping evidence. They map the ridge, they measure the water, they return to the same spot and check again. They look for consistency because the ocean is full of coincidences. Some anomalies come from biology, not vents. A swarm of tiny animals can change turbidity readings. A layer of different water can mimic a temperature bump. Even a ship itself can shed traces if protocols slip. So you treat every clue like it is guilty until proven innocent. That is not cynicism. That is survival. For a research budget, when the plume signals hold up, you start thinking in 3 dimensions. You think about how a plume rises until it becomes neutrally buoyant. That means it rises until its density matches the surrounding seawater. Hot water is lighter, but it cools quickly as it mixes. So the plume does not rise forever. It rises to a certain depth, then spreads sideways, like a slow umbrella. If you measure a plume layer at that depth, you can estimate where the source might be below. Not with perfect precision. With the kind of precision that lets you plan where to send your more delicate tools. This is the pivot point in the search. You stop painting broad strokes and start sketching details. You might switch from big water samplers to smaller, more agile sensors. Some teams tow instruments behind the ship, like a careful kite in the dark. A tow-yaw system can rise and fall through the water column as the ship moves. It samples continuously, tracing the plume like a fingertip tracing a crack in a wall. Others use autonomous floats, small machines that drift and listen. But the basic idea stays humble. You are not grabbing the vent. You are noticing it because the deep sea is too big to conquer and too patient to impress. Eventually, you build enough confidence to say, the source is probably in this patch of seafloor. Not the whole ridge, not the whole valley. A patch perhaps the size of a neighborhood. And the oceanographers, still half awake, begin to talk about sending eyes down. Not human eyes, of course. Human eyes are attached to bodies full of air pockets and fragile blood vessels. The deep ocean treats air pockets like a personal challenge. So you send a machine, but before you descend with the robot, you linger on what is happening down there, even without you. Because vents do not exist to be discovered. They exist because Earth is hot inside and water is nosy. And in the long quiet between surveys, the vent field keeps working. Seawater keeps sinking into rock. Heat keeps moving outward from the mantle and crust. Chemistry keeps rearranging itself, molecule by molecule. If you could stand there, which you cannot, you would hear something, not the dramatic roar people imagine. Sound travels differently down there, and your suit would be full of its own noise. But vents can hiss and crackle and thrum softly as fluid jets into cold water. Mineral particles precipitate out in a constant snow. It falls and drifts and coats nearby surfaces in fine grains. Some of it is metal sulfides, dark and heavy. Some of it is lighter minerals, pale and chalky. It builds layers over time like sedimentary pages in a book that no one reads. If the vent is a black smoker, the jet can be startlingly hot at the exit. Hot enough to make the surrounding water shimmer like a mirage, but the heat does not travel far. A few meters away, you are back in the usual cold, the usual dark. That contrast is part of what makes vents so strange. They are intense and yet localized, like a campfire in a frozen field, except the field is crushingly deep, and the campfire is made of chemistry, and the wood is the planet. This is where the story turns gently toward life, because any place with concentrated energy becomes a magnet. Not a conscious magnet, a metabolic magnet. Life is not noble. It is opportunistic. It finds gradients, it exploits them, it multiplies. And vents create gradients in a world that is otherwise monotonous. Temperature gradients, chemical gradients, places where electrons can be stolen and traded like currency. In the surface world, plants use sunlight to make sugars. Down here, microbes use chemical reactions to make food. This is chemosynthesis, which sounds elegant, and it is, in a deeply indifferent way. Hydrogen sulfide can donate electrons. Oxygen, carried down in seawater, can accept them. In between, organisms capture energy to build molecules they need. They turn chemistry into biomass. They turn rock-water interactions into living tissue. If that feels like alchemy, it is only because you are used to sunlight doing the heavy lifting. At vents, sunlight is irrelevant. There is no dawn, there is no noon. There is only the steady arithmetic of reactions. The foundational organisms here are usually microbes, bacteria, and archaea, the small workers you cannot see without help. They form mats on rocks, like pale fuzz. They float in the water, invisible until they gather. Some live inside animals, which is a polite way of saying they rent space in someone else's body. And the animals let them, because the microbes pay rent in food. This arrangement is called symbiosis. Again, it sounds friendly. It is mostly a business contract, written in DNA. Tube worms are the iconic example. Long, pale tubes anchored to rock, with red plumes waving at the top. The red is not decoration. It is hemoglobin, like your blood uses, but tuned for the vent environment. These worms have no mouth, no gut, no conventional way to eat. They rely on internal bacteria that oxidize hydrogen sulfide. The worm supplies sulfide and oxygen through its blood. The bacteria supply sugars and other nutrients. You could call it cooperation. You could also call it two organisms trapped together, because it works. Around the worms, you find clams and mussels. Many of them also host bacteria. They sit in clusters, shells half open, filtering water and feeding their internal tenants. Crabs and shrimp patrol the edges, picking at bacterial mats. Some shrimp have eyes that are reduced or modified because vision is not the main sense down here. Chemistry is. Smell, in a molecular sense, becomes navigation. A vent field is not just a place. It is a buffet line laid out along gradients of heat and toxicity. Too close to the vent opening, and the water can be too hot, too acidic, too loaded with metals. Too far away, and you lose the chemical energy that fuels the ecosystem. So animals arrange themselves in bands, like rings around a bonfire. Each species finds its comfort zone, which is a strange phrase for a place where hydrogen sulfide is everywhere. But comfort is relative. The deep sea makes you less picky. This is what oceanographers mean when they say, vent communities are islands, not islands of land, obviously. Islands of concentrated resources in an oceanic desert. Most of the deep seafloor is sparse. Food falls from above in a slow rain of dead plankton, fecal pellets, and sinking scraps. It is called marine snow, which is a cute name for a constant trickle of decay. In that background, vents are an oasis, except the water can poison you. And yet, life crowds in. Because where energy is abundant, scarcity loosens its grip. The vent field becomes busy, not in a frantic way, but in a constant way. Small movements, slow feeding, animals brushing past each other in the dark. The darkness is complete, except for the glow of the robot lights when they finally arrive. But even without robots, the vent field is not entirely black. Some animals and microbes produce light. Bioluminescence can flicker in the water column. Some shrimp might glow faintly. It is not like a lantern. It is more like a thought, briefly visible. Still, most of the time, vents are known by touch and chemistry, not by sight. That is why the discovery of vents, historically, was not just a biological surprise. It was a conceptual insult. It forced humans to admit that ecosystems can run on something other than sunlight. It forced the question of how life began and where it might exist elsewhere. But tonight, you keep your curiosity on a short leash. You stay with the practical work of finding these places again after they have slipped away. Because for decades, vent sites were sometimes reported vaguely. A plume here, a hint of particles there, coordinates with large uncertainties because navigation used to be harder. Early sonar maps were coarse, early sensors were less sensitive, and some expeditions simply did not have time to refine a location. A ship might pass through, detect a plume, note the area, and leave. Then, years later, another team tries to return, and the ocean, as always, has rearranged the fine details. Or the vent activity has shifted, or the old coordinates were never precise to begin with. So a vent becomes a rumor, a lost place in a place where everything is already hidden. Finding a lost vent is not like finding a lost city on land. There are no ruins to spot from a hilltop. There is only water, miles of it, and a bottom that looks the same until it does not. So the search becomes a patient loop. Map the ridge again with better tools. Measure the water again with better sensors. Use the new data to narrow the old uncertainty. If the vent is active, it should still be bleeding particles and chemicals into the deep. If it is not, you might find only mineral deposits, the fossil bones of a vent field. Even dead vents matter. They tell you where circulation used to happen. They tell you what the chemistry was, long enough to build chimneys and mounds. They tell you that the ridge has a memory, written in minerals. Some deposits are called massive sulfides. They are heavy, metal-rich accumulations. Built from years of venting, they contain copper, zinc, iron, and other metals humans love to extract. This is the part where you remember that discovery is never pure. If something valuable exists, someone will want it. But the science, at its best, moves slower than greed. It catalogs, it measures, it tries to understand the system before anyone drills into it. At least, that is the hope. Back on the ship, the lost vent search proceeds with calm repetition. The control room stays dim, screens glowing like small windows into another world. The ship traces lines over the ridge, like mowing a lawn you cannot see. Each pass adds detail. Each water cast adds texture. The plume signals, if they are there, begin to draw a shape. Maybe the strongest turbidity spike appears along one transect. Maybe dissolved manganese rises in a certain depth band. Maybe temperature shows a barely there bump, consistent across multiple casts. You stack the evidence, like layering thin blankets against cold. No single blanket is enough. Together, they make a picture you can trust. And as you refine the picture, you start thinking about the descent. Not your descent, the machine's descent. Because humans cannot casually visit a place where pressure is strong enough to crush steel spheres. If they are flawed, pressure at deep vent depths is immense, and it is constant. It squeezes every gasket, every seal, every cable jacket. It turns small engineering mistakes into expensive confetti. So the robots built for this work are cautious, thick-skinned things. They have buoyancy made from syntactic foam, a material filled with tiny glass spheres. It is light, but strong enough to resist crushing. Their electronics sit inside pressure housings, usually titanium cylinders, because the ocean likes to corrode everything else. Their thrusters are slow and deliberate. Fast movement stirs up sediment, and sediment ruins visibility. It also ruins your chance of looking competent on camera. So the robot moves like a visitor in a museum. Slow turns, gentle approaches, no sudden gestures near fragile structures. When the robot is launched, you feel the ship's deck vibrate under machinery. A crane lifts the vehicle over the side. It hangs for a moment, a dark shape against darker water. Then it lowers and disappears. On screen, you might see bubbles and foam at the surface, then only black. The descent is long enough for your attention to soften. The robot sinks through layers of water, each with its own temperature and salinity. Sunlight fades to blue, then to a dim twilight, then to nothing at all. If you have ever watched a room darken as a storm covers the windows, it is like that. Only the storm is miles thick. During descent, the team speaks in low voices. The pilot watches depth, altitude, heading. The scientists watch sensor readouts, looking for anomalies even before the bottom appears. Cameras show drifting particles, marine snow sliding past like slow stars. Sometimes, a jellyfish passes through the light cone, translucent and unimpressed. The robot's lights illuminate only a small circle, like a flashlight in a cave. Everything outside that circle is unknowable, and it stays that way. This is how most deep-sea vision works. Not a panorama, a tunnel. As the robot approaches the seafloor, the altimeter begins to count down. 10 meters, 5 meters, 2 meters. Then the bottom appears, not as a dramatic reveal, but as a gray texture resolving out of noise. Basalt pillows, rounded lumps formed when lava cooled quickly underwater. Broken talus, angular fragments from collapses. Sediment in thin drifts, like dust on a shelf no one touches. The robot hovers above it, careful not to land hard. Landing can kick up clouds that take hours to settle. Down here, the ocean is patient, and you have to match it. If this is a ridge axis, the terrain can be rough. Cracks and fissures cut across the seafloor. Some are narrow enough to swallow a cable. Some are wide enough to look like streets, dark corridors between rock walls. The robot's lights crawl along the edges, revealing fresh rock surfaces and older sediment-coated ones. Fresh basalt can look almost glossy, like it was poured yesterday. Older surfaces look duller, dusted with fine particles. You learn to read age by texture, not precise age, but relative. And vents tend to prefer the fresher, more fractured places, because water needs access. So the robot follows the geology like a scent trail. It drifts along fissures. It peers into depressions. It scans for the shimmering distortion of hot water mixing with cold. That shimmer is subtle. It is like looking across a road in summer heat, but underwater, in a light cone, with snow drifting past. If you blink, you miss it. If the camera angle is wrong, you miss it. If sediment is stirred up, you miss it. So the search on the bottom is as methodical as the search in the water column. You do not rush. You do not assume the vent will announce itself. You let the robot's circle of light slide slowly over the terrain. Sometimes you find nothing for long stretches, just rock, cracks, and the occasional sea cucumber lying like a forgotten glove. Then you see a hint of something, a patch of rock stained orange or white, minerals precipitated from vent fluids, a thin bacterial mat, pale against dark basalt. The mat does not wave at you. It just sits there, clinging to rock like a stubborn rumor. You slide the robot closer, and the camera finds texture. It is not slime exactly, but it is not rock either. It is a living film. Bacteria packed so tightly they look like paint. You think you are looking at a stain, but you are looking at a food source. And the food source is telling you, without words, that chemistry is leaking nearby. The pilot eases the thrusters, careful as a person carrying a full cup. A little too much wash, and the seafloor becomes a snow globe. Visibility collapses into gray, and everyone on the ship pretends not to sigh. So, you move slow. The robot's lights skim over broken basalt, following cracks like reading lines of a half-erased letter. You notice the rocks changing color in patches. Some are rust red, iron oxidized by vent fluids and oxygenated seawater mixing. Some are pale, chalky white, minerals deposited where warm water cooled too fast. The colors are not pretty down here. They are practical, like bruises and scabs. A vent field is geology healing in real time, and failing, and trying again. Then the camera catches it, the thing you cannot unsee once you learn it. A shimmer in the water, a wavering distortion. Not a creature, not a shadow. A waviness like heat above asphalt, except the asphalt is volcanic rock, and the heat is underwater. This is what oceanographers quietly call a visual plume. You can be meters away and still miss it if the light hits wrong. But when you see it, your brain finally agrees with the instruments. There's warm fluid here, rising into cold water and bending light like a tired mirage. No one cheers. They never do. Not really. They just start speaking even more softly, as if the vent might take offense. The robot angles down, and the camera searches for a source. The shimmer seems to come from a crack, a seam between two slabs. The opening is narrow, more like a tear than a hole, and out of it, water slips upward. Clear at first. You expect smoke. Sometimes you get smoke, but vents are not obligated to be dramatic for you. Clear fluid can still be hot enough to scald tissue instantly. It can still carry sulfide, methane, hydrogen, and dissolved metals. It can still build towers of minerals over time. The robot hovers, keeping distance, because heat is not the only hazard. Vent fluid can be acidic. It can be loaded with particles that scratch camera ports and clog intakes. Even the ocean can be petty about maintenance. The pilot shifts to a side angle. Now the camera sees tiny flecks streaming past, catching the light like dust. Not dust though, fresh mineral grains, precipitating as the vent fluid meets seawater. This is the vent's handwriting. This is how a crack becomes a chimney, grain by grain. If the flow is strong, the grains build fast, stacking into fragile spires. If the flow is weaker, the minerals spread into crusts and mounds. Either way, the seafloor is being coated in a slow, patient fallout. You keep watching, and you begin to notice movement that is not water. A small white crab clings to the edge of the crack. It is the size of a coin, maybe smaller. It does not look heroic. It looks busy. It picks at something invisible, scraping bacterial film off the rock. Nearby, a shrimp drifts into view, then backs away, as if reconsidering. Some vent shrimp gather in swarms, hovering where warm water meets cold. They like gradients. Those narrow bands where chemistry is edible and heat is survivable. Too close, and proteins unfold like cheap fabric. Too far, and you starve. So, they hold position in the in-between, the way you might hold your hand near a radiator. A little closer, and the light catches a tube, pale and rigid, anchored to rock. A tube worm, or at least the tube of one. Sometimes the worm's red plume is visible, waving gently in the current. Sometimes it is withdrawn, a cautious tenant refusing to show its face. Down here, caution is not a personality trait. It is a lifestyle. You look for the big spectacle people associate with vents, the chimney, the billowing black cloud. But vent fields are neighborhoods, not monuments. You might be staring at a quiet corner, a low-temperature seep, while the loud smoker stands a few hundred meters away. That distance is nothing on land. Down here, it is enough to hide an entire ecosystem behind a ridge of rock. So the robot continues, tracing the signs. Bacterial mats become thicker. Mineral staining becomes more intense. And then the camera lights find a structure that rises from the seafloor like a broken pipe. It is not smooth. It is rough, layered, crusted with minerals that formed out of water. The chimney's surface looks like wet concrete that never set properly. It has openings, small vents within the vent, where fluid jets out. And now the plume is visible as a dark cloud, not because the water is black, but because it is filled with tiny metal sulfide particles. Black smoker, the classic, a name that makes it sound like a bad habit, which is fitting. The vent is basically the planet chain-smoking minerals into the ocean. The jet is forceful enough to push the surrounding water aside. It rises fast, then curls and mixes, losing heat like a secret being diluted. You cannot feel the heat from the ship, but the camera shows the distortion at the chimney mouth. The shimmer so intense it looks like the water is glitching. If you were there, unprotected, your skin would not have time to complain. It would just fail. Congratulations, you have learned why humans send robots. The vent field around the chimney is crowded, not crowded like a city street, more like a campsite around the only fire for miles. Tube worms cluster in dense bouquets, their tubes packed together, their red plumes sway, opening and closing, regulating exposure to sulfide and oxygen. They are not plants. They only look like flowers because your brain is desperate to recognize something familiar. Clams sit half buried in sediment, shells gaping slightly. Inside them, bacteria live in their tissues, turning sulfide into food. The clam is a landlord with a very specific tenant. Mussels form dark clusters on the rock, attached by threads, holding on in a place where currents and chemistry are always trying to remove them. You see snails too, small and pale, moving slowly over bacterial film. Their pace is not laziness, it is efficiency. Calories are abundant here compared to the deep desert, but life still budgets. A vent field is not paradise. It is just less hungry than everything else. Some animals here have special hemoglobin that binds sulfide without dying. Some have enzymes tuned to high temperatures and low oxygen. Some simply live at the edge, where the water is only slightly poisonous. The whole community is arranged by tolerances, not by preference. Preference is a luxury item. You watch a crab climb over a tube worm cluster, picking at detritus and microbial mats. You see a fish pass through the edge of the light cone, then vanish. Fish at vents tend to be opportunists, taking what they can, then retreating to safer water. The vent does not feed everyone directly. It feeds microbes. Then the microbes feed grazers. Then the grazers feed predators. A food web built on chemical energy instead of sunlight. Chemosynthesis is the foundation here, and it is brutally simple. A molecule like hydrogen sulfide carries chemical energy. Microbes strip electrons from it, the way you might strip copper wire. They pass those electrons to oxygen, or nitrate, or other acceptors. And in the process, they capture energy to build sugars. And tissues, it is metabolism as bookkeeping. No romance, no sunlight, just transactions. The vent field hums with these transactions, invisible and constant. The robot holds position, lights steady, as if it is trying not to disturb the scene. That is not just politeness. A thruster blast can knock worms over, crack delicate chimneys, bury mats under sediment. And vents can be fragile in a way that surprises people. Yes, the planet is strong, but the structures built by venting are often brittle, hollow, and temporary. They can collapse from their own weight. They can be shattered by an earthquake. They can be snapped by a careless machine. So the robot's movements are slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. The pilot nudges closer to the chimney, but not too close. A temperature probe extends like a careful finger. It touches the edge of the flow, and the readout spikes. The number itself is less important than the idea. This fluid is hot enough to strip heat from the rock and still burn. It is hot enough to cook biological tissue instantly. But a few meters away, the water is back to deep ocean cold. This is the vent's strangest feature. Its intensity is local. Its influence is narrow. It is a candle in a cathedral-sized freezer, and yet its plume, once diluted, can drift for kilometers. This is why you could find it by chemical whispers before you ever saw it. Now you see it, and it becomes a place, not just a signal, not just a bump in a sensor trace, a real arrangement of rock and water and living bodies. And in the context of lost vents, this is the moment that matters. Because the vent you are looking at might be the one that slipped away from older expeditions. Or it might be a new one, born after the last visit. The deep ocean does not give you labels. You have to prove identity the slow way. The scientists begin to compare what they are seeing to old notes, old maps, drawn with thicker lines and larger uncertainties, descriptions of chimney shapes, descriptions of animal communities, depth readings that might be off by a little because older navigation drifted. In the early days, ships relied on less precise positioning. Before satellite navigation became routine, location could be fuzzy. Even with satellites, the robot's position on the seafloor is not the ship's position. There is a long cable or tether, currents, pushing it into a gentle curve. Acoustic positioning systems help, but they are never perfect. So, to find a lost vent, you do not trust a single coordinate. You trust patterns. You trust geology. You trust the shape of the ridge, the slope of the valley. You trust the chemistry that led you here in the first place. And you look for something distinctive. A cluster of chimneys arranged like teeth, a collapsed mound that looks like a broken beehive, a field of tube worms that spreads in a particular direction. Landmarks in a world where the light only reaches a few meters. The robot pans slowly, and the beam of light reveals a second chimney nearby. This one is shorter, more eroded, venting less vigorously. Its plume is weaker, more gray than black. Perhaps it is cooling. Perhaps its plumbing is clogging with minerals. Perhaps the heat source below has shifted. The way magma likes to wander, vents age in place, and they can die quietly. A dead vent is not an empty vent. It becomes a reef of minerals, a hard surface in a soft sediment world. Animals can still use it as shelter. Microbes can still colonize cracks where a little warm fluid seeps. Even when the main venting stops, the site keeps a memory. And for oceanographers, that memory matters. Because a dead chimney can confirm you are in the right neighborhood. Even if the active vent moved, you watch the robot drift toward a ridge of broken chimney fragments. The pieces look like shattered pottery, except the pottery was grown out of seawater. Some fragments are heavy with metal sulfides, dark and dense. Some are lighter, more porous, pale with minerals like anhydrite. Anhydrite is a calcium sulfate mineral, and it forms when vent fluid is very hot, but it dissolves in cold seawater over time. So, if you see anhydrite, it can hint at recent high-temperature venting. The vent leaves clues in its own architecture. This is geology as a diary, written in minerals that can dissolve, crack, and fall apart. The scientists talk about sampling, but they do it with restraint. A manipulator arm extends, slow and careful, like a mechanical wrist reaching for a fragile glass. It picks up a small piece of chimney, not the whole structure. It places it into a sample box, sealed for the ascent. This fragment will later be cut and analyzed. Its layers will tell a story of vent chemistry over time. The ratios of metals can hint at temperature and fluid composition. Isotopes can hint at sources, whether the sulfur came from seawater sulfate or deep rock. The chimney is not just a rock, it is a record of circulation between ocean and crust. The robot takes a water sample too, drawing fluid into a container that can keep it from reacting with oxygen on the way up. Because vent water changes fast when it meets normal seawater. Iron oxidizes, sulfide reacts, gases escape. So the sampling tools are designed to preserve a moment, like trapping steam in a jar. And still, by the time the sample reaches the surface, it has already begun to shift. Oceanographers accept this, and they design protocols to account for it. They measure what they can onboard quickly. They preserve what they can for later. They document everything, because memory is unreliable at 3 in the morning, even on a ship. As the robot continues its slow survey, you realize how vent fields can be missed. If the chimney is small, the robot might pass a few meters away and never see it. If the venting is low temperature, there might be no dramatic black plume. If the vent is tucked behind a ridge, the shimmer might be hidden unless you approach from the right side. And if the vent stopped venting between expeditions, the plume in the water column might be gone. The lost vent, in that case, is not lost because it moved. It is lost because it stopped breathing long enough for you to forget it existed. But tonight, you have something active, something verifiable. The robot circles slowly, mapping the site with cameras and sonar. Yes, the robot can use sonar too, at close range. It sends small acoustic pulses, creating a detailed map of chimneys and mounds. This is not the wide swath sonar used from the ship. This is intimate mapping, like running your hand over a surface in the dark. The resulting map will help future expeditions return. Better coordinates, better landmarks, better memory. This is how you prevent a vent from becoming lost again, at least for a while. But even with good maps, vents can still disappear. Because vents are not objects, they are processes. And processes do not sign contracts promising to stay put. An earthquake can reroute fluid in minutes. A lava flow can bury a vent field under fresh basalt. A crack can seal itself with minerals, shutting off flow like a clogged pipe. And when the flow stops, the animals leave, slowly or quickly, depending on their mobility. Tube worms can persist for a while if some seepage continues. But if the chemistry collapses, so does the microbial foundation. The oasis becomes a dry well. Other deep-sea scavengers move in, taking advantage of the hard substrate and leftover biomass. Eventually, sediment dusts everything, and the site becomes just another patch of rock. This is why the moment of finding matters. Not because you have conquered the deep, because you have arrived during the brief window when the deep is doing something noticeable. The robot's lights drift over a dense cluster of tube worms, and the camera lingers. You can see their tubes packed together, each one a stiff cylinder. The worms themselves are hidden inside, soft bodies protected by the tube. The red plume at the top is their interface with the world. It pulls in oxygen. It tolerates sulfide. It feeds the bacteria inside the worm's body. These worms can grow fast for the deep sea because energy is abundant. Some species can reach impressive lengths, meters long, though most of that is hidden in the tube. They can live for years, sometimes decades, which is long for an animal living on a geological leak. A leak that can stop at any time. Around the worms, you see smaller life, grazers and scavengers. A white limpet clings to the tube surface. A small snail navigates a mineral crust. A crab pauses as if it knows it is being watched, then continues picking at the mat. This is not a tranquil ecosystem in the way nature documentaries sell you. It is calm because everything is adapted to constant stress. The water is toxic by surface standards. The temperature can swing sharply within a few body lengths. The chemistry can change with shifts in flow. So the animals behave like experienced workers in a hazardous factory. They know where not to stand. They know where the food is. They do not waste motion. And the microbes, the real foundation, just keep multiplying wherever chemistry lets them. At this point, the ship above is a different world, a world of air and coffee and screens. But the connection is constant through tether and data stream. Every image is a delayed gift from the seafloor. Every sensor reading is a quiet confirmation. And with confirmation comes the slow work of documentation. You do not just look. You record. You measure. You build a map that another tired teen can use years from now. This is the kind of long patience humans are capable of sometimes. Not because we are noble, because we hate losing things we already found. The robot moves away from the main chimney, exploring outward. Vent fields often have zones. The hottest chimneys at the center. The loudest chemistry. Then the lower temperature diffuse flow zones, where warm water seeps through cracks and porous rock. These diffuse zones can be more important for biology than the dramatic smokers, because they are stable and they are survivable. A black smoker mouth can be too hot for most life, but diffuse flow, warm and chemical rich, creates broad habitat. It is like the difference between standing in a bonfire and standing near a heater. The robot's camera finds a place where the rock looks wet, reflective. Not from water. Everything is water. From bacterial film and mineral precipitate, glossy underlight, you see shimmering again, but lower, more spread out. Warm water is leaking through porous basalt, not jetting. The leak makes no heroic noise, but it changes everything around it. The rock is laced with tiny pathways, and the warm fluid chooses all of them. Instead of one chimney, you get a whole patch of gentle exhale. The light from the robot makes the seep look glossy, almost oiled. That shine is chemistry at work. Minerals precipitating in thin skins. You watch the shimmer spread like a heat mirage across uneven basalt. If you did not know what to look for, you would call it camera distortion. But the pilot knows, and you know now, that distortion is the point. This is the kind of vent that gets lost easily. It does not advertise itself with a black cloud. It does not build tall chimneys you can recognize from far away. It just seeps and stains and quietly feeds a neighborhood. The animals here are arranged in a softer gradient. Fewer towering tube worms, more scattered clams and small grazers. You see pale shrimp hovering, not in swarms, but in loose groups. They hold position where warm meets cold, like you at a doorway. Too far in, the water becomes chemically sharp. Too far out, the menu thins back to ordinary deep-sea scarcity. A crab walks across the seep zone with deliberate steps. It pauses at a patch of bacterial mat and starts scraping. That mat is not decoration, it is the foundation. You are watching food manufacture happen in place. The microbes take the vent's chemical offerings and they cash them in. Hydrogen sulfide becomes energy, energy becomes carbon chains become cells, and cells become a carpet. Then the carpet becomes lunch for something with legs. You can call it an ecosystem, and you are right. You can also call it a supply chain built on poisonous exhaust. Both descriptions are accurate, depending on how tired you are. The robot drifts closer, and the camera finds a delicate detail. The mat is not one uniform sheet. It is patchy and layered. Some areas look white, some yellowish, some a faint orange. Different microbes prefer different mixes of chemicals and oxygen. They sort themselves by preference, as if they had meetings. They do not have meetings, they have enzymes. Enzymes are just chemical opinions, repeated reliably. The pilot keeps the robot high enough to avoid stirring sediment. The scientists watch a temperature trace that rises, then falls. It is not a spike, it is a slow swell. Diffuse flow is like that, more blanket than blowtorch. And because it is gentler, it can be more stable. A chimney can collapse and a jet can shut off, but a seep can continue quietly, like a leak you never fix. This stability is why many animals choose the diffuse zones. You see a cluster of mussels anchored to rock, shells slightly open. They are filtering water and hosting microbes inside their tissues. The microbes do the chemical work, the mussels provide housing. Symbiosis, which sounds tender and behaves like a contract. The robot's manipulator arm extends toward the mussel bed. It stops short, hovering like a hesitant hand. Sampling here is always a choice, not a reflex. If you take too much, you change the place you came to learn. So the team chooses small, careful pieces of evidence. A single mussel, perhaps, or a small scraping of microbial mat, a bit of water from right inside the shimmer zone. They label everything with patient seriousness, because once you are back on the surface, you cannot return easily. Down here, you do not get casual second chances. The robot shifts its lights to the side, and you see something else. A low ridge of mineral crust, like melted candle wax on stone. This is vent deposit grown without drama. Hot fluid carries dissolved minerals. Cold seawater forces them out. Layer by layer, the crust thickens in place. It can seal cracks, redirect flow, and reshape the seep. The vent is building its own plumbing while it runs, which is an absurd design philosophy, and also very Earth. You begin to understand how vents migrate, not by walking, not by sliding across the seafloor, by clogging one pathway and opening another nearby. A crack gets lined with minerals, flow slows, pressure builds. Then the water finds a new fracture a few meters away. The ecosystem follows, slow at first, then quickly if the change is large. Life here is both stubborn and ready to move, because the reward is real, but the lease is unstable. A scientist murmurs a note about flow temperature. Another mentions the chemistry sensor, still reading elevated turbidity. Turbidity is just cloudiness, but here it is a compass. Tiny mineral particles make the water look faintly dusty on camera. Those particles are the same ones that drift upward as a plume. This is how the ship found the neighborhood in the first place. The plume was the whisper, and this seep is the mouth. The robot holds the camera steady for a long moment. In that stillness, you notice how the deep sea moves, not in waves, not in surface drama, in slow eddies, in drifting snow, in tiny shifts of animals. A shrimp tilts, adjusts its position, and stays in place again. A limpet inches forward across mineral crust, almost imperceptibly. Everything down here is either patient or dead. The pilot finally eases the robot away from the seep. Not because the place is less interesting now, because the work is to map the whole field, not one corner. Vents rarely exist alone, and the lost ones are the worst for this. You might have one dramatic smoker and several quiet seeps nearby. Older expeditions might have described the smoker but missed the seeps. Or they might have sampled a plume from a seep and never found a smoker. So modern teams build the picture by stitching together many small views. The robot moves along the edge of the vent field. The colors on the rock shift back toward plain basalt gray. The bacterial mats thin, then vanish into bare stone. Animals become sparse again, replaced by occasional wandering scavengers. This boundary is not a fence. It is a gradient. Energy fades with distance, and life fades with it. You are leaving an island, returning to the desert, and the contrast is so sharp, it almost feels like a moral lesson. But nature is not moral. It is just efficient. The robot turns and heads toward another set of stained rocks. The scientists are watching for repeated patterns. A vent field has a signature, and you learn to read it. Mineral crusts, shimmering water, dense biology, then tapering off. If you see that sequence again, you might have found another opening. If you do not, you might simply be at the edge. The robot's lights sweep over a small depression. Inside it, the rock looks broken, fresh, jagged. This kind of terrain often means recent volcanic activity. Fresh basalt can bury old vents and create new ones. It can also erase landmarks, making older maps useless. That is one way vents become lost, not by being hidden, but by being overwritten. A lava flow is the seafloor's version of repainting a room. Everything you thought you recognized gets covered in new black stone. The robot dips its camera into the depression's shadow. The water here looks still, but that is a trick of scale. A sensor shows a small temperature rise. Again, subtle. The pilot leans in closer, and the shimmer returns. Not a jet, not a plume, just a wavering, another diffuse seep. Smaller than the first. This is how vent fields spread out, not as one mouth, but as many pores. A field can be active and still look quiet. If you do not know, the scientists speak softly about coordinates and acoustic beacons. They are placing reference points in a way. Some teams drop small transponders on the seafloor. These devices answer acoustic pings with a known response. It helps the robot know where it is relative to the ship. It also helps future teams return to the same spot. You are watching humans leave a breadcrumb trail in the abyss. The ocean will not thank you for it, the ocean will probably bury it in sediment eventually. But for a while, it is a fragile line of memory. The robot finishes its slow loop through the vent field. It has video, sonar micromaps, temperature traces, and sample boxes. It has enough evidence to build a description that will survive time. That is what discovery looks like down here. Not a flag planted, but a careful data set. Not possession, but documentation. And if you are trying to reclaim a lost vent, that matters even more. Because the last team might have left only hints. A vague plume signal, a rough coordinate, a sketch of a chimney. Now you have something tighter, something repeatable. You can say, this chimney is here, at this depth, near this fissure. You can say, the diffuse zone extends this far to the east. You can say, the biology looks like this, in this band of warmth. All of that is a way of making the deep sea less forgetful. The pilot turns the robot toward open terrain. It starts the long return route, following a planned path. It does not go straight up yet. Sometimes you do one last sweep along the ridge axis. Sometimes you check a nearby valley for signs of more flow. Because once you have found one vent, you begin to suspect others. A ridge is a seam, and seams can leak in more than one place. The robot's circle of light glides over bare rock. Marine snow drifts through the beam, always falling. This slow snowfall is the background food source for most of the deep. It is dead plankton, tiny shells, fecal pellets, scraps of tissue, a steady rain of leftovers from the sunlit world above. Down here, nothing is wasted, not even decay. But at vents, the ecosystem does not have to wait for snow. It gets energy from below, direct and local. That difference is why vent communities feel like cities. Not because they are civilized, because they have concentrated resources and everything clusters around them. Back on the ship, the team is already thinking ahead. They talk about sample processing, storage temperatures, contamination control. Vent fluid is reactive. It changes quickly when exposed to air. Some gases escape, some metals oxidize, some microbes die. So you measure what you can as soon as you can. The robot is still down there, but the planning starts now. This is what field science does to your brain. It keeps you half in the present, half in the next checklist. The robot finally turns toward its ascent point. Its tether angles upward into darkness, a thin lifeline. The pilot increases buoyancy slightly, and the vehicle begins to rise. The seafloor falls away, not quickly, but steadily. The vent field's glow of life disappears into black. Not because it stopped existing, because your lights can only carry you so far. And this is the deep sea's constant reminder. You can visit, briefly, in a small cone of visibility. Then you leave, and the place continues without you. As the robot climbs, the temperature outside remains cold and stable. The water column here has layers, and you pass through them. You see subtle changes in particle density on camera. You pass through the neutrally buoyant plume layer. If you have sensors running during ascent, they can still detect it. A small bump in turbidity, a hint of dissolved chemicals. It is like smelling smoke again, but from the inside of the trail. The plume spreads sideways, carried by deep currents you cannot see. Those currents are slow, but they are persistent. They can transport vent signals far from the source. They also transport vent minerals into the wider ocean, not in chunks, mostly in dissolved traces and fine particles. Over long times, that matters for ocean chemistry. Vents are part of the planet's mineral budget. They add iron, manganese, and other elements to deep waters. They also remove some things by precipitating minerals onto the seafloor. It is an exchange, and Earth keeps the receipts in stone. The robot ascends for a long time. During the climb, the control room stays dim and calm. People speak softly because loud voices do not help machines. The pilot watches tension on the tether. The scientists watch battery levels and sensor health. Someone checks the weather above because the surface can be rude. You can do perfect work in the deep and still lose gear in waves. The ocean enjoys irony when it can afford it. At last, the camera begins to show a faint change in background. Not light yet, just a different quality to the dark. Marine snow becomes less dense, then more, as you cross layers. A jelly drifts into view, almost transparent. It pulses once, then slides out of frame. It is not impressed by your expedition. Nothing down here is impressed, which is oddly comforting. Eventually, far above the robot, there is a surface. There is air and starlight and a ship that keeps moving. The robot will break the surface like a slow returning diver. And then the work shifts into a different kind of care. The kind that involves gloves, labels, and cold storage. The kind that involves not dropping anything on a wet deck. When the robot is lifted back onto the ship, it looks smaller. It always does, once it is no longer framed by abyss. Water pours off its frame, and deck lights glare on metal. Crew members move with practiced steadiness, guiding it into place. There is no celebration, because there is still work to do. The samples are carried inside, protected from wind and contamination. A water sample from a vent is not just water, it is a chemical snapshot, and it will decay quickly. So you treat it like something alive, even if it is not. In a lab space that smells like plastic and salt, bottles are opened carefully, sensors are rinsed, data cards are checked, housings are inspected. A scientist takes a small volume of fluid for immediate measurements. They might measure acidity, or dissolved sulfide, or gases. Some measurements must be done right away, before the chemistry shifts. Others can wait, sealed and chilled for later analysis. You watch the process, and it feels oddly domestic. A sink, a counter, careful hands, quiet conversation. Except what you are washing off the robot is deep-sea mineral dust. And what you are holding in vials is water that touched hot rock. It is the planet's private plumbing, sampled politely. This is the part of the story where people often imagine conquest. They picture humans taking from the deep, claiming it, owning it. But the reality is smaller and slower. The best oceanography feels like borrowing briefly and returning gently, because a vent field can be fragile, even if Earth is not. A chimney can be snapped by a careless arm. A microbial mat can be smothered by stirred sediment. A community can be stressed by too much disturbance. So modern teams tend to sample sparingly, not because they are saints, because they understand that a ruined site is a ruined data set, and also because some wonder is worth preserving. You see this ethic in the way they talk. They do not say, "We will take everything we can." They say, "What do we actually need to answer the question?" Maybe the question is about chemistry. How much hydrogen sulfide is in the diffuse flow? How much methane is present and where it comes from? Is it produced by microbes or by rock reactions? Maybe the question is about heat flow. How much energy is leaking through this patch of seafloor? How does that change over time? Maybe the question is about biology. Which microbes are here and how they make a living? How the animals host them and how that relationship evolved? Or maybe the question is about the ridge itself. What does venting tell you about cracks, permeability, and magma below? A vent is a window into processes you cannot see directly. You cannot drill easily into a ridge axis without great cost, but a vent is already bringing deep chemistry to you. It is an unsolicited sample, delivered in warm water, so you take advantage of it carefully. A small rock fragment can reveal mineral layers. Those layers tell you about temperature changes over time. They tell you about the chemistry of the fluid and its sources. Sulfur isotopes can hint at whether the sulfur came from seawater sulfate or whether it came from deeper rock reservoirs. Metal ratios can reflect how hot the circulation was. Different minerals form at different conditions, and hydrite forms in very hot zones, but dissolves later in cold seawater. Chalcopyrite, a copper iron sulfide, suggests higher temperatures too. Sphalerite, a zinc sulfide, can form at slightly different conditions. These names sound like spells, but they are just minerals. And minerals are the vent's way of leaving a record. You also treat microbial samples with careful respect, not respect in a sentimental way, but in a contamination way. A vent microbe sample can be ruined by a fingerprint. Skin bacteria from the ship can sneak into the tubes, so you use sterile tools, clean benches, and protocols. You filter water through fine membranes to capture cells. You preserve them for genetic sequencing later. Sequencing will tell you who is there, not by sight, but by reading their genetic instructions. It will reveal bacteria and archaea, adapted to extreme chemistry. Some use hydrogen sulfide. Some use hydrogen gas. Some may use methane or iron or other chemical pathways. In the deep, metabolism is diverse in quiet ways, and vents are hotspots of that diversity. Even the animals become data in a gentle way. A muscle tissue sample can reveal symbiotic bacteria. A worm plume can be analyzed for hemoglobin adaptations. A crab might be identified as a species known only from vents. Some vent species are endemic, found nowhere else. They are tied to these temporary leaks like tenants in a shifting apartment. And that leads to a slower, heavier thought. If vent fields can shut down, what happens to the species? Some larvae can drift to other vents if currents cooperate. Some vents are close enough to act like stepping stones. Others are isolated, and isolation is dangerous for persistence. So, mapping vents is not just geology, it is also ecology and conservation, whether anyone likes that word. Because if you damage a vent field, you may damage a whole lineage. A lineage that exists nowhere else on Earth. This is where the phrase fragile starts to mean something. Not fragile like glass in a cupboard. Fragile like a rare book left in the rain. Fragile like a single paragraph in a language you do not speak that can still be erased. On the ship, that thought quietly changes how hands move. It changes how samples are chosen and how many are taken. and from where. Because in the deep sea, your most common mistake is assuming there will be time later. You think you can come back next year with better gear and a better plan. But the ridge does not promise you a next year version of the same place. A vent field is an active conversation between rock and water. If the conversation ends, the speakers do not leave forwarding addresses, so the sampling stays small and it stays deliberate. A little vent fluid, sealed fast because oxygen will rewrite it. A tiny chimney fragment, bagged and labeled because layers are timestamps. A thin scraping of microbial mat, preserved like a smear of living paint. You take what you need and you leave what you can. Not out of kindness, exactly, out of realism and out of scientific self-interest. A damaged vent is a damaged measurement, and the ocean is already hard enough. Even the way you store things has its own quiet drama. Some samples go into cold rooms because heat changes chemistry quickly. Some go into acid-washed bottles because trace metals stick to dirty plastic. Some get fixed with preservatives because cells fall apart once you change pressure. Pressure is the part everyone forgets. Down there, water squeezes everything with the steady insistence of depth. When you bring vent fluid up, gases want to escape. Carbon dioxide wants to fizz out like a soda opened too warm. Methane wants to leave solution and form bubbles you did not have before. Even microbes can behave differently when the squeeze is gone. Some of them are piezophiles, pressure lovers, adapted to deep compression. At the surface, they are not heroic. They are confused. So when you analyze, you do it with humility. You ask, what did this sample look like before we ruined it by rescuing it? Oceanographers build methods around that problem. They take in situ measurements, meaning measurements made down there, not up here. Sensors on the robot log temperature right at the vent mouth. Electrodes can estimate dissolved sulfide without waiting for surface reactions. Optical sensors can watch particles scatter light, a proxy for plume strength. Sometimes there are specialized samplers that try to keep pressure. They are heavy, awkward, and worth the trouble. Because a deep sample that stays deep, chemically speaking, is a rare gift. And still, the ship is not a laboratory building. It is a moving platform with salt spray, vibration, and people who need sleep. So you make compromises and you document them. You write notes that sound boring because boring notes are honest notes. Time of collection, depth, temperature at intake, which bottle, which filter, which preservative, because later, when results look strange, you will want to blame the ocean. The ocean will not care. So you learn to blame your own methods first. In the background of all this careful handling is the bigger reason you bothered. Hydrothermal vents are not just exotic biology postcards. They are plumbing vents for the planet itself. They move heat out of new crust. They move chemicals between rock and ocean. They quietly participate in cycles that run longer than civilizations. When seawater circulates through hot basalt, it changes. Magnesium gets pulled out of the water into altered minerals. Calcium can be added, depending on conditions. Sulfur can be swapped between seawater sulfate and rock sulfides. Metals are mobilized, then dropped again as mineral deposits. You can think of it like the ocean, sending a letter into the crust. The crust answers by dissolving the ink and sending back a different message. Over millions of years, that exchange matters. It helps set the chemistry of seawater. It helps regulate how the ocean stores certain elements. It helps build deposits that humans later argue over. And it gives the deep biosphere, the microbial world under the seafloor, a steady source of energy. Not all life advents lives on the outside. A lot of it lives inside rock pores, in warm cracks, out of camera view. There are microbes in the crust that never see a tube worm. They live on hydrogen made when water reacts with minerals. They live on small chemical gradients in narrow spaces. They are part of what people call the deep biosphere. It is a biosphere measured in pores and fractures and invisible patience. Studying vents helps you study that hidden life too, because venting is one of the few places where the subsurface leaks its signatures upward. You also learn vents are not all the same personality. Some are basalt-hosted, typical of mid-ocean ridges. Others are hosted in ultramafic rocks, mantle rocks pushed closer to the surface. Those places can produce more hydrogen through a reaction called serpentinization. Serpentinization is rock turning into a different rock by drinking water. It sounds peaceful. It is actually a chemical factory that can feed microbes for a long time. Those systems can vent fluids rich in hydrogen and methane. And when methane shows up, you have to ask where it came from. Some methane is biogenic, made by microbes. Some is abiotic, made by rock reactions under heat and pressure. That distinction matters because it changes how you think about life elsewhere. If rocks can make methane without biology, methane stops being a simple life detector. It becomes a clue, but not a confession. This is how vents quietly complicate your fantasies. They are beautiful, but they are also annoying, scientifically. Every answer comes with a footnote. Back at the bench, the scientists run through these questions like a slow inventory. They look at dissolved manganese because it is a good plume tracer. Manganese tends to stay dissolved longer than iron. Iron likes to precipitate and stick to particles and fall out. So manganese can travel farther and whisper longer. They look at helium isotopes sometimes too. Helium is a noble gas, meaning it does not react much. Some helium comes from the mantle, especially helium-3, compared to helium-4. If you detect mantle-style helium in a plume, it hints at deep sources. It is like smelling the planet's interior on your instruments. They look at pH, which is acidity. Because vent fluid can be acidic, mixing zones can swing pH quickly, and that affects metal solubility. They look at silica, because hot water dissolves silica from rock. And they look at microbes, because microbes are always the point eventually. What genes are present? What metabolisms are possible? Who is oxidizing sulfide? Who is oxidizing hydrogen? Who is using nitrate instead of oxygen when oxygen runs low? Each of these measurements is a small flashlight into a bigger system. And each measurement is also a reminder that the vent field is not a single object. It is an engine running on heat and water and cracks. So you take your careful little samples and you try not to overinterpret them, because one bottle of vent fluid is not the whole vent. It is a sip from a moving stream. The ship continues to drift and work while all this happens. There is always another cast to do, another line to survey. Ship time is expensive, and weather is fickle. So the expedition balances two impulses: the desire to sit with the vent and understand it deeply, and the need to keep moving because there may be more vents nearby. That is how you slide into the next question, the quieter one, that always follows discovery. How common are these warm leaks really? Not in your feelings, in actual geography. Because mid-ocean ridges wrap around Earth like seams on a baseball, a long connected system of spreading centers. If vents exist here, they can exist in many places along that seam, and they do. But finding them is not guaranteed, even with modern tools. Some vent fields are loud, black smokers with thick plumes. Those are easier to track because the water column practically tattles. Other vent fields are low-temperature seeps. They leak fluid that is only modestly warmer than deep water. They can be chemically rich and biologically important, and still almost invisible. Instruments can tow right past them and record only a sigh. And then there are vents under sediments. In some areas, hydrothermal circulation happens beneath a soft blanket. The warm fluid percolates through mud, diffusing into seawater without a chimney. No dramatic tower, no smoky jet, just a broad patch of altered chemistry. Those can be harder to detect because the plume is diluted quickly, and sometimes vents occur at ridge segments that are not well mapped yet. Because even now, huge areas of the seafloor are mapped coarsely. It is an uncomfortable fact that you know the surface of some planets better. At least those planets are kind enough to sit still for satellite images. The ocean insists you look through it, and that takes time. So, vent discovery is still partly a numbers game. You survey, you listen, you sniff the water, you follow hints, you miss things, and you come back and you find them later. That is why vents can be called lost in the first place. Not because they are mythical, but because coverage is sparse. There are long stretches of ridge that have never been visited closely. There are transform faults, offset cracks, and back arc basins. Back arc basins are spreading centers behind subduction zones. They can have different chemistry, sometimes richer in certain volatiles. Vents there can be acidic and full of dissolved gases. Each tectonic setting changes the vent personality. Even on the same ridge, vent fields can differ. If the crust is more permeable, circulation can be broad and cooler. If magma is shallow, vents can be hotter and more focused. If sediments are present, chemistry can be different again. So the deep ocean is not one vent story. It is many variations on the same theme repeated quietly along a global seam. And because it is global, it becomes part of global ocean chemistry. Vent-derived iron can be scavenged by particles and sink, or it can be stabilized by organic molecules and travel farther. Deep currents can carry these traces across basins. Eventually, some of that iron can upwell and feed surface ecosystems, not in a simple straight line, but in slow, large loops. The ocean is a conveyor belt system with no respect for your impatience. Vents are small points, but the ocean integrates everything over time. It takes local leaks and smears their influence into the planet's chemical background. That is part of why people keep looking for more vents. Not just for the creatures, though the creatures help fund the wonder. For the budgets of heat and chemicals, for understanding how much heat escapes through circulation, for understanding how the ocean's composition has been shaped over Earth history. And once you have the thought that Earth hides warm oceans in its dark places, it becomes hard not to look outward. Not in a dramatic way, not in a science fiction poster way, in a cautious, almost tired way. Because if vents can run an ecosystem without sunlight here, then sunlight is not the only option elsewhere. People point often to icy moons, Europa orbiting Jupiter with an ice shell and a likely ocean below, Enceladus orbiting Saturn, smaller but famously leaky. Enceladus shoots plumes of water ice into space from cracks near its south pole. Those plumes contain salts and organic molecules and hints of hydrogen. Hydrogen can be a sign of water reacting with rock, like serpentinization. And if you have water, rock, and chemical gradients, you have the basic ingredients for vent-like energy. You do not have proof of life, and you should not pretend you do. But you have a reason to be interested. A hidden ocean does not need sunlight if chemistry can do the job. Europa's ocean, if it exists as expected, is buried under kilometers of ice. Dark, cold, pressurized, and old. It would feel psychologically familiar to an oceanographer. It would also be completely unforgiving. If there are hydrothermal systems on the seafloor of Europa, they would be impossible to reach with today's tools. But the idea changes how you think about habitability. Habitability stops meaning a warm surface with gentle weather. It starts meaning any place where energy gradients persist long enough. Vents teach that lesson without trying. They just sit there, leaking heat and quietly undermining your assumptions. Back on Earth, the expedition does not need icy moons to stay busy. There is plenty of hidden warmth here. Some vents have been seen once, decades ago, and not revisited. Some were inferred from plume signals, but never visually confirmed. Some have names that sound like jokes, because humans name things when nervous. Lost City is a famous vent field, and it is not actually lost. It is carbonate towers, pale and eerie, built in an ultramafic setting. Its fluids are alkaline, not acidic, and rich in hydrogen. It looks different from a black smoker field, like a different genre of the same story. And it is a reminder that vent types can vary wildly. So when you ask how common vents are, you have to ask which kind. High-temperature smokers are easier to notice, but may be rarer. Diffuse flow is widespread, but subtle and easily missed. Sediment-hosted systems can be broad and quiet and chemically complex. And then there are cold seeps, which are not hydrothermal vents at all. Cold seeps leak methane and sulfide from sediments, often on continental margins. They host chemosynthetic life too. They can look similar biologically, but the heat source is different. The deep sea is full of these overlapping categories, and your brain wants neat boxes. The ocean does not offer them. So oceanographers learn to speak in careful terms. Vent, seep, plume, anomaly, field. Words that admit uncertainty, because certainty is expensive down there. As the nights on the ship pass, the work settles into a routine. Survey lines, instrument casts, robot dives, sample processing. A vent field is a discovery, but it is also a schedule. Meals happen when they can. Sleep happens in fragments. The sea surface remains indifferent, rolling under the hull. Sometimes the weather calms, and the horizon is a flat black line. Sometimes the wind rises, and the deck becomes loud with spray. And through all of it, the deep stays the same kind of dark. The vent field does not know you are there. Its fluids keep circulating. Its microbes keep multiplying. Its chimneys keep growing and cracking and rebuilding. If you stop watching, it continues, which is both insulting and comforting. Insulting because your expedition feels important to you. Comforting because it means the system is not performing. It is simply existing. There is a moment late in the expedition when the crew is quieter than usual. Not because something is wrong, because the main work is done and the ship is turning back. You have your maps, your plume data, your video, your samples. You have narrowed uncertainty into coordinates that future teams can trust. The lost vent is lost no longer, at least on paper. And now you begin the slow shift away from the deep. Not emotionally, that will take longer. Physically, the ship changes course and the ridge slides behind you. But the final work still needs doing. You run through data quality checks. You back up files because hard drives fail at sea with ugly timing. You log metadata because unlabeled data is just expensive noise. You clean gear because salt is a patient destroyer. You pack instruments into cases that smell like rubber and old seawater. Everything you brought out must go back, and it must go back intact. The ocean likes to keep souvenirs, and those souvenirs are usually yours. On the last robot recovery, the surface is calmer. The vehicle comes up slowly, bobbing like a tired animal. Deck lights reflect off wet metal, and crew members guide it in. There is a particular sound to wet equipment on steel deck. A dull clank, a scrape, and the steady hiss of water draining away. Inside the vehicle, there are hours of abyss stored on drives. Inside the sample boxes, there are small pieces of chimney that grew from hot fluid. And inside the bottles, there is water that was briefly part of the planet's deep circulation. You carry those pieces into the lab space again. You do the final labeling. You tape lids. You seal bags. You check inventory lists. It is not romantic, but it is the real conclusion of most expeditions. Paperwork as a form of respect, because if you lose track of a sample, you might as well have dropped it back into the sea. As the ship steams away, the deep ridge keeps its quiet work. New crust forms somewhere along the seam. Old chimneys crumble somewhere else. A vent that was active when you arrived might weaken next month. A crack that was sealed might reopen during the next small earthquake. The deep is not static. It just moves on timescales that mock your attention span. And now, as you ride the ship's gentle motion, you begin to notice the surface again. The air feels warmer, even if the night is cool. The sky looks huge, because at sea there are no buildings to interrupt it, and the ocean surface, which seemed simple at first, now feels like a lid over an entire geography of ridges, valleys, chimneys, and living mats. The ship's wake stretches behind, a pale disturbance that fades quickly. It is a temporary signature, like everything humans do here. In a day, it will be gone. In a week, the water will have mixed and forgotten. The only lasting changes are the ones you accidentally caused on the seafloor. A thruster wash that shifted sediment, a sample chip taken from a chimney, a marker beacon left behind. Small things, but small things matter in a place built from slow accumulation. This is why careful teams talk about leaving the deep undisturbed, not in a holy way, in a practical way, and an ethical way that overlaps with practicality. Because a vent field is both sturdy and delicate. The planet will keep venting heat regardless. But the exact arrangement of life and mineral architecture is a narrow outcome, a particular crack at a particular time with a particular flow. You can study it without flattening it if you try. And trying is the most you can ever promise in